Hello, my name is Talia Stroud, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where I direct the Center for Media Engagement. And it's a wonderful opportunity today to get to chat with you about social media and misinformation. We've been doing a lot of different research projects related to social media and misinformation. And what I'll share with you today are a couple of projects and insights that we've gleaned from doing this work. So to begin, I want to make the case that social media use is incredibly common around the world, and in particular in South Korea and the United States. Here, what I'm sharing with you are survey data gathered from people in both countries via the vendor YouGov in December of 2019. And we asked people to just tell us, do you use these various forms of social media? And as you can see from this chart, there's widespread use of social media, YouTube and Facebook leading the bunch, with Instagram and Twitter following up behind. And then you have people in each of the countries noting that they use LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Reddit as the options that we examined in our survey. So social media really has become a dominant place where people are going and where they're spending their time. And the big concern that we have with social media is it really is a place where we see the distribution of so-called fake news, a term that's gained some notoriety, or a term that I prefer to use, misinformation, which is information that, based on the best available evidence, is not correct. And it could be shared knowingly or unknowingly, but it nonetheless could have effects on what people think about the world in which they live and their attitudes. Here's just a leading example of this sort of content when information that Pope Francis shocks the world and endorses Donald Trump for president was circulating on social media outlets. And of course, this is not the case. This is not correct information. But social media was able to provide a forum for people to share this. Just some brief background on misinformation and what it is overall. So first, misinformation, it's nothing really new. We've had rumors for decades, centuries. So misinformation isn't something that just emerged onto the scene all of a sudden following here in the United States, the 2016 presidential election. It's something that's been a phenomenon with us for a very long time. However, it's particularly important to pay attention to misinformation now because social media allows it to circulate to such a degree. In fact, in the United States, one analysis found that misinformation actually outperformed real news on social media in the midst of the 2016 election, which is really disturbing if social media are providing a platform for this sort of problematic content to spread rapidly. We also know that misinformation actually can be combated. So there are strategies that social media outlets can undertake to try to deal with misinformation. And these include things like demoting content that is known to be that is known to be misinformation, fact checking the content to determine whether or not it is misinformation or not, and otherwise removing people from platforms that have a track record of sharing misinformation. The final thing to note is that misinformation is constantly evolving. So what we think about misinformation now may not be what we come to know about misinformation tomorrow. And the fact that it is constantly evolving means that there's such a need and a demand for researchers to examine how misinformation is being created, how it's being shared, and what effect it has on people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. The argument that I want to make to you today is fourfold, and I want to argue to you that when we think about social media and misinformation, that there are four things that are just really important for us to think about. And those four things are: first, identity, so your own identity and what you think about the world in which you live. The second is attention, so how much people are paying attention to misinformation and to efforts to try to correct misinformation. The third is phrasing. The way in which we're talking about misinformation actually has great implications for how people are processing it. And the fourth is partnerships, because when we're talking about social media, we are talking about for-profit companies, and they have proprietary access to data that would allow academics to really study these phenomena well. And so when I'm talking about partnerships, I'm thinking about, are there strategies and ways in which academics could actually collaborate with platforms? And I'll say more on that in a moment. So to begin, I want to chat about identity and how that relates to misinformation in the modern media ecosystem. So misinformation really is a problem in part because of identity. Like identity is part of the core of what makes misinformation troubling. And this dates back to theories like motivated reasoning, which suggests that sometimes people process information directionally. They have a preferred conclusion, and when information is coming in, they process it based on that preferred conclusion. So, information that agrees with the conclusion is readily adopted, and information that discounts that conclusion is dismissed or counter argued. Now, this is the directional form of motivated reasoning, of course, and Kunda argued that there was also an accuracy motivation where, in some circumstances, people will be driven to seek out information in a balanced and objective way. But how often people do that is a major question. And we're talking about topics that relate to a person's identity and the way in which they think and view the world. This may be an area in which people are less able to accurately and even handedly process information. So there's lots and lots of research showing that people judge information more critically when it counters their beliefs and more charitably when it conforms to their beliefs. And there's ample evidence that this happens in the domain of politics, which is the area in which I'll focus most of this presentation. There's been work demonstrating that misinformation in particular is processed based on one's beliefs, attitudes, and identity. So for instance, in some research that I've conducted with my colleague Jay Jennings, we found that people are more likely to believe misinformation when it matches their political identity. So when people hear that Trump has done something terrible, if you're a Republican, you're less likely to believe it. If you're a Democrat, you're more likely to believe it. And so this facet of partisanship really plays a role in what people think about misinformation. But we needn't think about partisanship in the context of the US system alone when we're thinking about misinformation and how people process it. It can really be in any context where people have a strong identity that influences the way in which they see the world. And in any of those contexts, it's ripe for people to process misinformation in ways that conform to their beliefs. So we could see this with attitudes toward vaccination, for example, or climate change. What we've proposed is a two-step motivated reasoning model to try to understand how this works in terms of the way people approach misinformation. And there's nothing particularly innovative about this two-step motivated reasoning model other than it compiles a whole lot of research that's been examining misinformation and the processing of not only misinformation, but corrective efforts. And so the two-step model starts with first, a person is presented with some sort of misinformation that they then assess. And based on that type of misinformation, they then engage in some motivated reasoning that influences the degree to which they believe that misinformation. And we're calling it target-based because it depends on the target of the misinformation. Is the target pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination? Is the target Clinton? Is the target Trump, for example? And here there's been quite a bit of research finding that these patterns are in fact symmetric around partisanship. So Democrats and Republicans are both likely to practice this sort of motivated reasoning. So that when I see misinformation that agrees with my beliefs, I readily adopt it. And when I see misinformation that disagrees with my beliefs, I'm likely to counter argue that. So this first step of a motivated reasoning model is to assess the misinformation. We know when we examine corrective efforts, which is the second step of this model, that they are also subject to motivated reasoning. And in the presentation today, I'm going to focus quite a bit on fact-checking, which is the enterprise of examining claims that are made and assessing them for their truth or falsity. And in the United States, fact-checking is a critical response to misinformation. And it's actually one adopted by platforms like Facebook around the world to try to counter misinformation on the platform. But in the United States, the fact-checking enterprise has actually been critiqued. And people, when they're looking at fact checks, are processing them in ways that conform to their held beliefs in the same way that they do when they approach misinformation. So fact checking in the United States and research around that has shown that organizations like PolitiFact, which is a national and respected organization, is actually more likely to rate Republican claims as false compared to Democratic claims. And a series of research articles have purported and found evidence for this. So that may lead people on the political right in the US context to be somewhat skeptical of fact checkers and the work that they do. Adding to this, conservative media have criticized the fact-checking enterprise. And in response, it's unsurprising that Republicans have a less favorable view of fact-checking compared to Democrats. So all of this is to say that there is an identity component wrapped up in how you process the original misinformation, but there's also an identity component in how we process the attempts to correct that misinformation. And so that's what takes us to the second part of this two-step model. So in this second part of the two-step model, people are actually engaging in what we're calling source-based motivated reasoning, which is where they think, when I'm encountering this fact check, do I believe the fact check? And so I'm thinking about the source of the correction. And in this context, we actually find asymmetric partisan effects, where Republicans are more likely to dismiss fact-checking information because they question the source, the fact checker. And Democrats are more likely to adopt it. So when people are confronted with a fact check in response to some form of misinformation, if they don't trust the fact check much at all, then the fact check is not trusted and the misinformation is in fact believed. If, however, they do trust the fact-checking organization, then the fact check is trusted and the misinformation is not believed. So it's a more complex understanding of the way in which we process and encounter misinformation. We encounter the misinformation and have opinions on the basis of that. And then a second step, we encounter fact checks and then have opinions related to the fact check information. So all of that is to say, identity is an important component of how we understand the way in which people process and interact with misinformation. The next argument that I want to make to you is that attention is another aspect of misinformation to which we really need to be, in fact, paying more attention. And what I mean by attention is when we look at analyzing fact-checking, many of the studies that embark upon this work, in fact, force people to look at misinformation and then force people to look at fact checks. And force, I don't mean this in a bad sense of the term. I mean that that's just the way in which we typically do experiments. We expose people to some content and then afterward we assess how they're responding to that content. And the realm of misinformation and fact checking is no exception. In fact, in the recently published meta-analysis in political communication, all of those studies that assess whether or not fact-checking affects our responses to misinformation are based on experiments that show people and require them to look at misinformation and require them to look at fact-checking. In some research that I've done with several colleagues published in Human Communication Research, we've actually found that there are differences between forcing people to look at information and allowing people to select information on their own. And when we're thinking about misinformation in a social media environment, the truth of the matter is that we have lots of latitude to select and pick what we look at. It's not only our individual choices, but it's also potentially reinforced by algorithms that show us some things and not others. And so when we are actually thinking about misinformation, where it circulates most commonly on social media, the fact that we're not incorporating the ability to choose and interact with content into our studies, I think is particularly worrisome. Now, this isn't to say that all studies have done this and haven't considered attention, but it is to say that the bulk of our understanding of misinformation and fact-checking from the experimental context is based on scenarios in which people are forced to look at misinformation and fact checks. So, given that we know that people have many choices, how does this then relate to the way in which people interact with the misinformation on social media? So the first is, in some research, again, the research that I've done with my colleague Jay Jennings, we find that clicking on misinformation is actually affected by identity. So people are more likely to click on misinformation when it conforms to their beliefs compared to misinformation that does not. So in this environment where people have choice, they choose to sometimes look at misinformation and sometimes to not do so. They also choose whether or not they're going to engage with a fact check. Research published in the Journal of Communication by Shin and Thorson suggests that Republicans are in fact less likely to engage with fact checks on Twitter. And those who do are more likely to write comments hostile to fact checkers. And this is an important insight because it suggests that these same identity patterns play out on social media. And it's because people have a choice. They choose not to engage with particular fact checks in ways that correspond with their partisanship or their identity. And all of this is to say, the conclusion of all of this is it's really important to create realistic choice environments. And we've had some research that starts to make this sort of progress. So for instance, there's been some studies that actually present screenshots of a Facebook feed to make it appear more realistic in how people are engaging with that material and information. And in some of the research that we've been doing, we've been actually creating mock Facebook news sites that actually look like a Facebook interface where you can leave a comment, where you could like something, where you could share information. Now, it's not perfect. It's really hard to create a full mock Facebook environment that includes your image and the types of friends that you might encounter therein. But some people are trying to advance the study of social media by doing exactly this work, putting people in more and more realistic choice environments. And there are ways to do this that don't involve a lab sort of experimental setting, whether that's a survey experiment or one conducted in a formal lab setting, by doing real world field experimentation, looking at how people engage with fact check information, which is something that we've been exploring, and I'll say more about that in just a little bit. But the end conclusion of all of this is that when we think about misinformation, we have to think about attention, because a lab setting where people are forced to look at it may not map onto what people do in the real world setting of social media. The third area that I'd like to discuss today is phrasing. How exactly are people notified once they've encountered misinformation, and are there better ways to do that? So when Facebook first was proposing ways of dealing with misinformation, their original idea was that they would include a flag like you see here, appended to misinformation, saying that the misinformation had been disputed by third-party fact checkers. And there's been all sorts of questions about the efficacy of this sort of an intervention. So on the one hand, there's been questions about, does that actually draw your attention to the misinformation, because it's so out of the norm to see a big red box with a triangle in the middle of your Facebook feed. So does this unduly attract attention to misinformation? Another component of this, and one in which we've been quite concerned, is the use of the word disputed. Because the word disputed makes it sound like there's actually a conflict among fact checkers, rather than fact checkers all agreeing that, in fact, this is a problematic piece of information. So what we wanted to do is create a mock news feed that people could actually interact with in ways quite similar to what they could do on Facebook. And so this is an example of one of the stimuli that we created that's fully functional, in order to do some experimentation on how people engage with this disputed third-party fact checker tag. We also wanted to examine, is there another way? Is there another way to phrase this that changes people's behavior? And so instead of disputed by third-party fact checkers, we actually conducted an experiment and manipulated whether it said disputed or whether it said third-party fact checkers say this article is false. So a much more blunt treatment, alerting people to the fact that the information presented is not correct. And when we did this study, what we found is that it is the case that saying that information is false has much greater effects than saying that the misinformation is disputed. However, the effects in the study that we conducted were actually confined to Democrats. So when Democrats encountered this statement that third-party fact checkers say the article is false, they respond in expected ways, reducing their beliefs in misinformation. Republicans, however, were unaffected by any of these treatments, saying that misinformation is false, saying that it's disputed, relative to a control condition where they weren't told anything other than here's some information that wasn't clearly labeled as misinformation or not. So the takeaway from this is that phrasing matters. Saying it's false and being blunt about the way you phrase things was more persuasive than saying disputed. And what I mean by persuasive is it reduced belief in misinformation. However, it didn't work across the board. It didn't work for Republicans, and that probably is wrapped up in identity and where we started this conversation earlier, where there's perhaps a stigma associated with fact-checking as an enterprise that it favors one political party. So with that in mind, we conducted another study, and based on some research published in the Journal of Communication, not ours, but what Bode and Vraga showed was that if you include related articles, that could be an effective means of addressing misinformation in the health domain. So we wanted to do a couple of things. First, we wanted to check whether that same thing was true if we brought it into a political domain rather than a health domain. And second, we wanted to evaluate whether that was the case if we changed the source. So instead of just saying fact checker, what if we actually used congenial sources? So places like the Weekly Standard, which is a verified fact checker, or at least it was when it was still functioning. And the Weekly Standard is and self-describes as a weekly conservative magazine. So can you tilt the odds in favor of different partisans actually adopting corrective misinformation? So in our study, we not only named the fact-checking source, we also added a tagline that directly identified what the source claimed to be. So we used the Weekly Standard, and we also used PolitiFact, which is an organization that purports to suss out truth from falsity. When we did this study, however, our findings are intriguing. And if anything, what they show is that what matters is not so much the partisan affiliation of the fact-checking source, but the description underneath it that provides people with more information and context about the fact-checking source that's being used. So adding this tagline, whether it was to the Weekly Standard or to PolitiFact, in fact, reduced misperceptions among Republicans. And we found some evidence of the efficacy of these sorts of fact-checking efforts among Democrats as well. So the big takeaway from this is not so much the specifics, but to say that phrasing actually really matters, and we need to be particularly attuned to how we phrase fact-checking efforts. The final thing I want to talk about is partnerships. And as I mentioned earlier, studying misinformation on social media is challenging because of issues of access and realism. It's really hard to create a fake social media environment in which people engage in realistic ways. So I think the key to this is embarking upon partnerships with social media that can help and that can be a component of how we think about this. Drawing from the recent book released by Josh Tucker and Nate Persily, we need to think about how we engage with platforms. In some instances, we should be partnering with them. In other instances, we should be going around them. And in other instances, we should just be working with them to gather data that we can use. And I think that all of these should be in the repertoire of what we do to try to understand this really important source of information and misinformation that's affecting the way in which people think about politics. I've embarked upon a couple of these sorts of partnerships, not only the massive and recently announced partnership to study the US election, but also ones to examine how people think about fact checking. And I'm happy to chat more about those and how that works. So in the end, my 4 arguments about misinformation on social media are: we have to think about identity, we need to pay attention to attention, phrasing really matters, and partnerships are critical. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and please feel welcome to reach out if you have any questions about any of this content or would like to speak more about social media and misinformation. Thank you so much for your time.